All right, come on in, come on in.
Give it a second.
Yeah. It's been a couple days since we've done this. It's not just me today. This is going to be fun. I don't think so.
Well, maybe not.
What did they say in Tool
There we
Time?
go.
I don't think so, Tim.
Hopefully
All right, there we go. Okay, people are coming in.
we need to.
Hi, Kai. How's it going?
What do we call that when the audio goes forever and ever?
It just keeps going. Hi from Kansas. What's up? Hey, it's...
Let's introduce everybody. Who do we have?
Yes, she is, Chris. Okay, welcome in, everybody. It's not just me today. Thank God. This is nice. This is going to be fun. We've got Paul E. Walsh here, okay?
Or Paul Walsh.
Paul Walsh. Well,
don't call me Paulie. I'll get mad.
I thought, see, but this is the thing, because I thought our producer, Jim, he was said, okay, how do what's the name again? And he says Paul E. Walsh. But now I realize you were talking about your Twitter name, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I thought
Paul
like you
Edward
wanted to be
Walsh
referred to as Paul E. Walsh, like the Michael J. Fox type of deal.
From now on, I'm going to be Paulie. Hey, Paulie.
Yeah, exactly. Paul E. Walsh. So, this is the first time Paul and I have met. Paul is a meteorologist, and he's more of an expert in really kind of taking what happens with the weather and relating it to the economy and how it kind of affects money and things like that. And I mentioned this is the first time we've met, so we've been just hanging out a little bit.
And my first Periscope, by the way.
Yes. Now,
yeah, absolutely.
Here's the thing. I always see Paul on Twitter. I see him through the email chains and stuff like that. And, you get to see the little box of the face. Is the mustache going away a recent thing, or is that a...
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So that's a recent thing. Are
Yes.
you enjoying it? Is it better?
I am. I've had it for a long time, but the more television that I do, especially Skype, the only thing I see in my face is a big, giant sort of caterpillar-looking thing, and so I had to do away with it.
Good stuff.
And this morning, actually, Al Roker, I was on with him, 6:45 this morning, 6:15.
Yeah.
And he called me out on it, but he said it looked good, so I'm going to leave.
Good. Hey,
I'm going to go without it.
It's a good look. We'll take it. All right. So here's the deal. I don't know a huge amount about what you do. Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of the people watching probably don't either. So, we were just talking a little bit, and there was a lot of interesting stuff. So,
weather affects me. I'm in retail, so there you go. Let's
right.
launch with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good idea. Yeah, somebody just talked about how weather, affects you when you're in retail.
Yes.
So, what would you say, at least recently, what has been like the biggest way that the weather has affected the economy?
A great question, and in fact, that's what I was talking about with Al this morning, and then also with Jim Cantori on AMHQ, was the first quarter of the year, which is January, February, and March. The Commerce Department puts out their first assessment of how the economy is going, and as it turned out, the economy grew by only 0.2%. Which is a low number, but even more significant is that the expectation was that it would grow by 1%. The reason, or part of the reason that they're attributing to that slowdown is the weather. And it's really specifically the weather in, of course, the Northeast and the Midwest. So I'll use the PV word, the polar vortex. I did that today, and Jim was giving me a little hard time.
I thought you were talking about positive vorticity.
No, that's right. I am doing a Weather Geeks later today.
Nice.
So that's an example of just how big of an impact the weather has on the economy. And the reason the weather has that big of an impact on the economy is that the weather has a big impact on every one of us. Basically, we shape our lives around the weather, and increasingly we shape our lives around the weather forecast. And because we are consuming weather forecasts from a lot of new ways, specifically our cell phone, we're using it more and more than ever. And so the effect that the weather has on the economy is profound. And the other thing that's really, really interesting is because the weather is predictable. Yes, it is predictable. Mm-hmm. That means you can also predict the effect that the weather will have on consumers, therefore on business. If you know that, you can be a lot smarter about the way you plan your business.
So, we always talk about this. I think a lot of people very frequently are always at least asking me questions about the long-term forecast. And, I'll be honest, the answer I always give is like, look, I'm not really into long-term forecasts. I mean, look, I like to focus on how things affect people, So, for instance, the hurricane forecast, when that comes out.
Right.
This year we've got like a below average year expected.
Well below.
Yeah, well below average in the Atlantic basin. But you know what? If one hurricane hits everybody still remembers it as like maybe a big season,
Right,
for them.
right.
So that's kind of why I don't go into that too much. But, a lot of money changes hands based on some of these long-term forecasts at
Yes,
times.
yeah.
And so, how do you deal with that kind of stuff?
Well, you're right. And in terms from a business planning perspective, you have to have a view into the future to help you sort of strategize around that. And it's as I noted before, the weather has such a profound influence on consumers. It becomes a really important planning piece. From a long-range forecast perspective, there's two ways to look at it. First of all, we actually are getting better at making those sort of mid-range predictions, the 3-month outlooks that we do. And our sister company, WSI, has been doing that for years and years. The difference, though, between that and a weather forecast, of course, is that those are what I call ish forecasts. So we're looking for broad areas across broad times that'll be sort of, colder than normal. And if you know how to interpret that from a business planning perspective, then you can use that to help you influence your plans. Hurricane forecasts are a little bit different in that I don't think there's a lot of actual businesses that use that information. It's kind of gee whiz, and my concern specifically about this hurricane season is really related to the fact that the headlines are it could be a historically quiet year, which is inherently dangerous, I think.
Right.
Especially for people like, for example, Florida, where there's not been a strong, long landfall falling storm in 9 years. And since then, there's at least 1 million people that have moved there that have never experienced a hurricane. So when you sort of overlay this prediction that you don't really have to worry this year with people that have never experienced it, you're setting up what could be a very, very sort of chaotic period when the inevitable forecast comes.
Right, exactly.
And it's the forecast that drives people, to go to the store.
I think it's a really interesting point you make because you said the fact that something hasn't happened in a really long time, that can force people to be complacent. But, we almost see the opposite of that during severe weather season a lot, The fact that maybe certain areas, they get so many severe thunderstorm warnings or so many tornado warnings.
Right.
And then it happens so often and you get a little bit of a false alarm rate and then all of a sudden the big one hits and people are like, look, nothing ever happens when these come out. What's the big deal? You know what I mean? So you're saying it's kind of the opposite when, for a place like Florida, you said 1 million new people live there since the last hurricane hit.
Right.
And so, I think there is probably going to be a level of complacency. That's a good point.
And there's going to be a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of public service going on and a lot of information out there. But, at the end of the day, people tend to read the headlines.
Right.
And remember and internalize those headlines. And it's the first one that always does it. If there are multiple storms, of course, the next one, people will be ready. But I think this year there's a setup for a pretty big surprise.
Yeah.
But I'll say one other thing in terms of business preparedness. Businesses are very sophisticated in terms of how the hurricane affects them, how it impacts their customers, and they've gotten very, very good at being able to sort of anticipate that. So they make sure they have enough of the right products.
Yeah. How about the Colorado floods? We've got somebody that's been talking about the Colorado floods in here, things like that. Do smaller scale events like that? I mean, I know we've been talking about kind of, the big hurricanes that'll come in and affect large areas, but I mean, you have events like maybe a tornado or a flood or something like that can affect really small areas. And, yes, it can cost a lot of money to rebuild after a lot of these things, but does it really affect kind of the whole economic look as a whole?
Usually no. The smaller ones don't move the needle in terms of the overall economy. And even when you've got a big storm like Sandy, for example, that does impact the overall economy, but that's generally a temporary impact. Yeah. And what typically happens with a large event like that is there's a rebound after the storm. So after the storm, there's money that flows in to sort of recover from the storms. That actually drives employment, and it sort of brings back all the economy that was lost.
Right, and it's it's interesting because there are a lot of businesses that are based around disaster response. You know what I mean? Like they make their money when, the disasters happen.
Right.
I mean, even here at the Weather Channel, when we have bad weather, that's when things go the best for us. I mean, that's, part of the business. It's just kind of how it works. We did have a question here. Janice, I believe, said, okay, we're looking at the map down here. She says, I see a lot of words but no numbers. Like, what are the numbers going to be? It's a little bit too early to tell. When we're doing a long-term forecast, this is actually a forecast for May all the way through July.
Right.
Okay, and so it's not going to be perfect. It's more of just a generalized idea of kind of, hey, these areas will be a little bit below average, these areas will be above average. And you can see actually a pretty decent chunk of the country, all the way from the southern plains up through the northeast, looks like below average temperatures. Now, when you see that, I think a lot of people probably see the blue color and they're like, oh man, it's been so cold in the winter,
Yes.
like I'm so sick of it being cold.
Yes.
This doesn't mean it's actually going to be cold outside, okay?
Right.
It just means it's going to be a little bit below average. So
Yes.
say the average high for maybe a spot in Ohio in June would be in the 70s or something like that. Maybe the temperature will be in the upper 60s or low 70s or something.
And I think that's a really, really good point. And what happened last year, which is relevant to the discussion here, was that we had in July the second coolest summer on record in the Midwest.
Wow.
Now, I was in Chicago in July. It was fabulous.
Yeah.
So when you've got colder than normal, if it's dry in the middle of summer, the
Can be
impact
nice.
Exactly, the impact on all of us as consumers is that, here, watch me now.
Yeah.
The polar opposite
Yes,
of what
I see what
happens
you
if you
did.
have that
Well done.
in the middle of winter. One thing I will say, though, is that the way I sort of view the world when I'm looking at from a planning perspective,
Mm-hmm.
we talked about this a little bit before we went on the air. A really important metric for businesses and how they sort of view the world is what actually happened to them last year. So I just noted that July was well below normal in the Midwest, which means there's a lot of people out, there's a lot of people spending money. It was really good for the economy. The way that they plan for this upcoming July is not based on a long-range forecast, but based on what we call climatology, or what is the average weather for that area normally. And they compare that to what actually happened last year. So if you use Climo as a predictor, which is the best predictor, if you're looking beyond a week or 2 weeks, it's very, very apparent that we're going to see a July timeframe in the middle of the country that's going to be hotter than it was last year. It could even be a tad cooler than normal. Now it looks like our forecast is actually looking at the Chicago area actually being warmer than normal. So when you combine that and you look at July, then it's very easy to make the assessment that you're going to be using your air conditioner more in July if you live in the Midwest. If you live in
Exactly.
Chicago, you're going to be buying things differently. You might not even be outside as much. You might not be golfing as much because last July in Chicago, I'm telling you, it was fabulous.
Yeah.
I was running on the lake shore. It was even a little chilly in the morning, but I was loving it.
It's funny because people think the upper Midwest doesn't get that hot, but I grew up in Milwaukee. I mean, you've got a part of that summer there where it's pretty hot and humid, and it gets uncomfortable there
Brutal.
for a while. Yeah,
Yes.
it does get quite brutal.
I lived in Rantoul, Illinois, when I was as an Air Force meteorologist. All my training was at Chanute Air Force Base, which is long closed. But my God, that summer was hot, and I didn't have an air conditioner that year either,
Yeah.
so it burned in my brain.
Oh, it's brutal. Burned. I see what you did there. We've had a couple questions about El Nino. I've been watching some of the questions, and please forgive me if I don't hit yours. Just keep asking it, and I'll try to get to it. But basically what people are asking is this an El Nino year? Is this all because of El Nino? Well, El Nino has a lot of different effects on different parts of the world. Now, one of the big effects that it does have that we can actually draw a pretty solid correlation is it tends to quiet down the hurricane season a little bit in the Atlantic, especially.
Right.
So that's why we've got a well below average forecast for hurricanes in the Atlantic this year. But like we said before, if one hurricane hits, that could still be a pretty big deal. And by the way, we want to take questions here. I mean, we can sit here and talk the whole time, but that's the whole point of Periscope. So if you've got any questions, please let me know.
And your point about the hurricane forecast and the skill and the actual predictors. From a numbers perspective, based on the fact that we've got this El Nino, I think it's pretty likely it will be a relatively quiet year.
Yeah.
But we have absolutely no idea where any of the storms will go.
Exactly.
And that's where that risk is. And that's why if you happen to live in Florida, I would say be more prepared this year than ever because
Yeah.
of the fact that when the event happens, which inevitably something will happen, it's going to be crazy at the
Yeah.
at the stores.
Okay, so somebody asked, what is El Nino? I've never really understood it. Okay, so El Nino, it basically refers to, there's this area in the Pacific Ocean, okay, and the temperature of the water there can swing a little bit. It can actually have some pretty big swings from year to year. If the temperature of that water in the Pacific Ocean is a little bit below average, it would be a La Nina year. If the if the water temperature in that part of the Pacific is a little bit warmer than average, that would be an El Nino year. And like I said, it really depends on which part of the world you live in. It has a lot of different effects on different parts of the world. Even different, regions in the United States can see a lot of different effects during the different seasons, a lot of different things like that. But I mentioned one of the biggest things is the hurricane season in the Atlantic tends to be a little bit on the quieter side. What would be the scariest natural disaster to experience? I guess that depends. I mean, if you get caught in the eye of a hurricane, that'd be pretty rough. I've heard some stories of, people that have been in their bathtub while their house is getting demolished during a tornado. I bet if you talk to some people in Nepal that survived the earthquake, they probably would be telling you right now that would be the most scary one. I guess it really depends on your experience. Somebody also asked, are you wearing is that an iWatch? Is that the iWatch?
It's a Pebble.
Pebble, nice.
Yes, so I'm a, yes.
Nice, look at this.
Oh, no way, my
Yes.
producer's got one too. I
Pebble
was going to
brother, yeah.
ask, is that the
Love
same
it.
one?
So Jim and I are early adopters.
Yes, we are.
Actually,
Very
I
nice.
actually like this, and it's a lot cheaper than the iPhone. The iWatch. I mean, I might buy the. I'm waiting
Yeah.
for everyone else to buy the iWatch.
Someone said it was like the size of an iPad, like the thickness of an iPad. So basically, you're wearing an iPad on your wrist. I kind of feel like we need to,
That's crazy.
Yeah,
I don't know, I love the Pebble. I think it's very
I do too.
The new version's coming out in May.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Does Pebble work with iPhone, somebody's asking?
It does.
Does it?
Yes.
Okay, see, these
So
are the guys to ask, because I'm a Droid guy.
What
I don't know
happens when
anything
I've been getting like messages on my watch as we've been talking. It's like James Bond.
Yeah, there you go.
007.
Do you have like detonation on there?
I'd tell you,
It's
but
like-
I'd have to kill you.
Yeah, I see what you did. Somebody asked, is global warming affecting temperatures around the world? Yeah, the temperatures are generally on the up and up. That's been the trend over the last little while. So a lot of different factors, but certainly, humans are definitely at least playing a role in that for sure.
I think it's also important to point out that one of the reasons that the weather is becoming more impactful is that there's just more people living in areas that are prone to getting impacted. And those people are interacting with weather information more than they ever have before.
Yeah,
That's why it's so...
This is why I try to be careful, and, yes, there are a lot of good studies out there that show certain things, but I try to be careful, with saying that, certain events are going up, like, oh, we've got more tornadoes, or we've got more, because nowadays everybody's got phones, everybody's got cameras.
Right.
Anytime there's a tornado, somebody's going to see it.
Yep.
And it's almost like that kind of pumps the numbers a little bit, so, it's an interesting discussion to have, but, look, working in a news organization, especially one so focused on the weather, I'm glad that people have all these cameras. Now, some people do some stupid things and try to get too close to the tornadoes. Look, it's a free country. If you want to do it, fine. I'm not going to say you should. But there's been some amazing video that has come out, and it definitely helps us when we forecast stuff. Another good question from Darwin. Can we expect a calm hurricane season? Well, like we've been talking about a little bit, we're forecast to have significantly less than average hurricanes in the Atlantic this season, but that forecast has nothing to do with where they're going to hit.
Right.
So, I mean, we could look on average. I think we have about 12 named storms. Is it? Maybe we can bring up that max graphic, Jim. What do you think? Yeah, Jim's going to bring it up in a second. But the forecast, at least from Colorado State, I believe, and Weather Channel also has a forecast that's out as well.
I think the consensus for almost all of them are for a lower than normal number of storms, but that does not equate to a calm season because, as already noted, there's no way to know where those lower than number storms will go.
Yeah.
Every one of them could hit the U.S., and we just have no way of knowing that. So from a preparatory perspective, you got to be ready.
And this was another thing that we can relate to the economy. Like I said earlier, a lot of money gets thrown around, with futures and like this kind of stuff. I don't know much about it. I really don't, to be completely honest. It's completely out of my comfort zone. I did not do well in economics in school. Okay, but I'll get to your question in just a second there about the California. But do you think it's a little weird that happens because the effects can be so different? Even if we've got the forecasting down, even if we know that this forecast is right that you're seeing below for the amount of hurricanes, because the effects can be so different if they hit places or not. So is that a little weird that so much money gets exchanged over this kind of stuff?
In what way?
I mean, like trading and that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting. And from a trading perspective, where the weather influences, where the weather has the biggest influences in terms of futures prices, that's really based on the forecasts. So, for example, our part of our company, WSI, does these long-range forecasts. A lot of the customers are energy traders as well as utility companies.
This is what I'm talking about. Yes.
And when their forecast comes out, because they've been doing these forecasts for a long time, there's a certain level of skill there that the traders understand.
Okay.
So if WSI puts out a forecast tomorrow that said it's going to be a hotter than normal summer, then the futures price for energy is going to shoot up. So the price moves on the forecast, not on the actual weather.
Yeah.
Because they're all trying to anticipate what's going to happen.
That's what I thought the interesting thing was about it. So I just wanted to pick your brain about
You'll
that
also
a little bit.
see during hurricane season, if we have a storm going into the Gulf that's going to impact
We'll get to it.
the Gulf rig system, you'll see the price of oil spike.
There we go. Somebody just asked about
Right.
does weather affect the price of gas?
It does in terms of from an oil perspective, and then there's also seasonality to gas that's sort of not exactly impacted, not exactly the same as that, but yeah. So from an oil perspective, typically though what happens is it drops right back down. But when the storms start to come, again, it doesn't have to hit. It's based on where the prediction is.
Right.
That's where the price spikes.
Oh, it's interesting stuff. Very interesting. If there was a hurricane with your name, would you secretly hope for it to be the biggest storm? Probably not. Wouldn't want to go
then
down
you'd be
in history
retired,
for that.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. They would retire the name. That's certainly not going to happen in any sports for me. Let's see. What impact will the drought have in California? It's had a lot of impacts.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's not good. Here's the thing that most people don't really realize, I think. So much of our food comes from there. Like the Central Valleys of California, there's so much farmland out there.
Yeah.
Even just me kind of preparing for some of the videos that I've been doing, to be honest, I haven't been out to California very much. I didn't even know how much farmland there was out there. I mean, you see the commercials, there's a lot of cheese made there, they want you to know that. And look, as a proud Wisconsin guy, I do support Wisconsin cheese, but look, I've had good cheese from California. But that, I think, is one of the biggest effects, and of course, that affects the economy too, right? Drought, big time.
It does, and the agriculture economy is huge. California is the largest economy in the U.S., and I want to say it's about the 9th largest in the world. And of course,
Wow.
water fuels all of that. And agriculture makes up a big portion of how much of that water is consumed. On the positive side, the effect that it's going to have for all of us from a pricing perspective is not going to hit right away. It's going to take a while. There's still plenty of groundwater that they're using. The problem is groundwater, number one, it costs more to bring it up, so ultimately that will hit our pocketbooks. The other thing is it's not regulated, so they don't exactly know what's going to happen if they start taking too much out of it, which is causing the ground to sort of sink, so that's a big problem.
Right.
And then one other thing on that, I actually did a story on weather.com on weather and wine, specifically focused on the Napa Valley, and I interviewed a winemaker, a guy named James Hall, he lives in Napa Valley. He's got a great company doing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Anyway, I talked to him last week to sort of follow up on the story that I did on weather.com, and last year he was very positive and very sort of optimistic about the season because they had just gotten that there was like a Pineapple Express event, and that basically gave them the water that they needed for the year, and they were very optimistic for their vintage. And sure enough, they had one of the best crops they've ever had last year because they had just enough water and they didn't have a frost. And they're also now very optimistic about this year because they've had enough water. So for the wine lovers out there, at least for the near term, no problem.
That's a nice thing about wine. You can get decent wines for a good price, It doesn't have to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, what was I going to go into? Let's see. Do we got any more questions? We're here to take your questions. That's what we're here for. The other thing with the drought is that it's not going to go away for a while. I mean, this is the type of thing that we've even had a couple pretty decent bouts with rain. We'll have a storm that'll come in and sit over North California for a little bit. Dump some rain, even Central California. But that kind of stuff isn't going to help. It maybe just a super tiny bit. What we really need is that snowpack up in the mountains.
That's the big problem.
That's a huge problem.
And I don't know the number. The percent of normal snowpack this year versus last year is ridiculous.
We can actually look at that real quick. Hey Jim, would you mind grabbing let's see, what would it be? The percent of normal. I think it's in drought. I think there's a drought folder, and maybe it's got percentage of normal in there. If you can't find it, that's okay.
And the key to that is that they call that their frozen reservoir. And so the frozen reservoir basically is empty. So so your point is very well taken. Now, if we have an El Nino year, as it appears we're already in, and will continue, they will likely get a lot more rain next year, next spring. But
I think it was something like 15%, if I'm not mistaken. Something really low of the snowpack, that's up in the Sierras.
And by the way, the ski industry in California has got crushed by that. They have to close early, and that's a huge business.
See, that's why we like having Paul here. He knows all these little tidbits about stuff that you don't even think about. You know what I mean? Like, we think about the farming.
If you're running a ski resort in Tahoe.
Exactly, and that's a great point.
Or a hotel or a restaurant up there.
Somebody was saying, is it possible that the summer forecast could be wrong? Yeah, it's possible. Look, it's almost like odds in Vegas, kind of. You know what I mean? Like we can get a pretty good idea, so it's pretty good odds that something like that's going to happen. Once in a while, it will turn out that it could be completely flipped upside down and completely wrong, but it's not likely.
That's why I call it an ish forecast, because it's going to be cool-ish, and then from a probability perspective, I don't know what the odds that we've put against this, but if you assume a 65 or 70% probability, then there's a 40% probability that it won't be. So it's great guidance, but it's not gospel.
Okay. All right. Do we have any more questions? What do you think, Jim? Are we running dry on content? Ooh, bad joke.
Well, I think this is a great introduction to Periscope for Paul Walsh.
It is.
Yes.
I think you need to be doing it more often.
I will be. So we've got a blog at Weather Channel called forecastfactor.weather.com.
Here, I got you. Forecast Factor.
And if anybody's interested in this kind of content, you can sign up for it. It doesn't cost anything. And I think what I'm going to be doing is that, because I do a post every at least once a week, I may do a companion Periscope, because this is awesome.
Yeah.
This is kind of cool.
It's good fun. And, you're based up in Philadelphia. If you ever stop by Atlanta again, pop on in. We'll do another.
I will be here.
If Paul loses
hide
his mustache, we'll have 6 more weeks of summer. That was Matt. Very nice. Well done. A slow clap for you,
yes.
Matt.
The answer is yes.
Good stuff. All right. Adios. Thanks for stopping
guys.
in. This was fun.